Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Poa, and today I am bringing you my wrap-up for July for my priority of reading Hugo Finalists. So this month I had put 10 books on my TBR of books that I still needed to read in order to finish up the categories that I wanted to read for the Hugo Awards, as well as just a couple of extras that Susha had gotten me in the graphic novel category, things like that, which I wasn't necessarily going to vote in, but since he got it for me, I wanted to read them. So of these, I managed to read 8, which is pretty good, and I thought that really there's a lot of good things being nominated for the Hugos this year, so it was just a very fun reading month. First, I'll talk about the novellas that I read in July. So one of the novellas that I read was Gods, Monsters, and the Lucky Peach by Kelly Robson. This is an interesting, almost sort of dystopian future science fiction that also has time travel. It takes place hundreds of years from now when the Earth has gotten kind of bad. You know, we have not done a great job of keeping the Earth healthy, and humanity has suffered for it. They have gone underground for a long time, and they're re-emerging, and they're trying to rehabilitate the Earth. And there is a scientist who is especially focusing on riverbeds that is trying to rehabilitate, I think, Calgary. And she gets the opportunity to go as part of a time-traveling team back to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in, ancient Mesopotamia to study them and gain information about them. And this is a big deal. A lot of the story focuses on the kind of almost grant writing process, the application for bidding for that job, a lot of the bureaucracy, a lot of the monetary concerns, a lot of the just paperwork. So there's a really interesting focus that makes me feel like somebody who's heavily involved in the sciences actually wrote this, because I think that's the reality of science a lot of the time. So that was super fascinating. I think that the exploration of the impact on the way that society functions due to ecological issues is really interesting. The ethics of time travel is really interesting. So there's lots of interesting themes in this. It is a very dark book though. I just felt like it was a little bit on the kind of grim side of looking at the future. There was not so much hope. So that I struggled with a little bit, but it has a very cool premise. The other novella that I read was The Tea Master and the Detective by Aliette de Bodard, and this is a Sherlock Holmes retelling. So it's set in space in the future in the Shuya universe, which is Aliette de Bodard's sort of Vietnamese culture and mythology inspired future. And it is so cool. I love the setting. There's a huge focus on kind of, I think, Vietnamese values of, family and honoring one's elders. There's also a lot of just kind of neat things like the focus on tea. There's really cool cultural aspects to this story, and the Sherlock Holmes retelling is so good. I have been rereading Sherlock Holmes with my husband he's been reading it to me, really, for the past couple of years, and they are just such cute little stories. And this embodies those stories really, really well while improving on many of the aspects that I find a little troublesome with the original, such as kind of Watson's fanboyishness towards Sherlock. So in this story, that is, I think, done much better. The premise is that there is a spaceship, and here the spaceships are sentient, and the spaceship is contracted by a Sherlock Holmes character who is a detective that wants to research kind of the decomposition of corpses. And they go out into deep space, which is kind of a crazy, mind-bending type of place. And while they're there, they find a corpse that shouldn't be there. They are expecting to find some dead bodies from like a shipwreck, and instead they find a new dead body. And so that precedes them to look into what had happened. So it's a really cool mystery. There's a lot of interesting explorations of just kind of some cultural issues, as well as things like self-medication is a big theme in this. So I thoroughly enjoyed this story. I thought it was a great Sherlock Holmes retelling, and the setting was super cool. Now moving on to the novels that I read in July. So the first was Record of a Spaceborn Few by Becky Chambers, which is the third book in the Wayfarers series. And this is a sci-fi series where, almost like Star Trek, it's kind of set in this future. You've got a lot of different races, a lot of different types of sapiens, and they're all trying to, interact and get along. This book, the third in the series, focuses on a group of humans, and they are part of a kind of like a group, a fleet of generation starships, and they have a very unique culture that has evolved because of this, and it's kind of like a socialist utopia, kind of almost communist utopia. So it's very interesting to see the way that Chambers imagines how humanity will deal with being on generation starships where they go for a long time and they are very self-contained and people have to care for one another and participate in community. So this has a lot of really interesting themes of community and culture and history. It also explores kind of the whole life and death cycle, as well as what happens when such an isolated community comes into contact with outside cultures, and how that can change their cultures. And then there's a lot of issues of adaptation, of immigration, of how do you deal with these past values in a new world where that may no longer be the way that you interact with things. So lots of really cool themes, and it's just very moving. It made me cry in the middle, although there are a little bit of an issue with the beginning and the end of the book where it's a little disjointed because it's more of a patchwork story, and in the beginning and the end it's just very separate for each person, whereas in the middle it kind of comes together cohesively as a story. Even so, it's a very moving, really sweet story. The other novels that I read in July were Raven Strategem and Revenant Gun, which are books 2 and 3 in the Machineries of Empire series by Yoon Ha Lee. This series is a military SF series that has very interesting technology. So in this world, technology is based on the strength of belief of the people in that area in a specific religion, in a calendar system. And so this series blends sci-fi with sort of religious belief or strength of belief. It has a great focus on math, but also a really interesting focus on community and belonging and loyalty. And a lot of the technology has this very fascinating dependency on simply belief systems. So it's a really fascinating world, and it explores a lot of interesting themes. Yoon Ha Lee is a trans man, and there are so many curious and interesting explorations of gender, of identity, of belonging, of loyalty to your culture versus sort of who you are. There's just a lot of layers to this series that make it absolutely fantastic. Plus, it has so much military strategy and political intrigue and just mystery throughout. So this is a really, really cool series that I highly recommend. Next, I finished 2 comic books for July. The first was Abbott by Saladin Ahmed et al. And this is sort of like a supernatural detective film noir story. And it takes place in the 1970s in Detroit, and it follows Abbott. And Abbott is a Black female, I think she's probably in like middle age, like I feel like she's in her 40s, investigative journalist. And she investigates a lot of things that are happening in this very corrupt city, focusing especially on some of the racial tensions and the treatment by the black community by the police. And within this setting, she discovers that there are some very gruesome murders that are occurring in a very strange way, and it ends up being supernatural, and she has to kind of follow the leads and figure out what's going on. So I thought that the premise of this was really interesting. The focus on racial inequality and social justice, the centering on this extremely strong, powerful Black woman as the main lead who was just investigating all of these things. Those were all super cool. The comic itself was a little bit gruesome though. There were quite a lot of scenes of these murders that was a little bit much for me. And sometimes the characterizations of people's was a little, you know, overdone. But even so, I thought this was a really cool comic that addressed a lot of interesting themes. The other comic that I read was Black Panther, Long Live the King by Nnedi Okorafor et al. And this is the first in sort of like a reboot of Black Panther. I am not familiar with the Marvel Universe, and I found that going into this, I mean, at least I had seen the Black Panther movie, so I had some idea, but even so, I was pretty lost. I didn't really understand a lot of things that I think were assumed. I didn't know who some characters were that were introduced. It felt very disjointed to me, and the plot just felt completely underdeveloped, and like there were holes in everything. And I think that's just because if you are somebody who's in the Marvel Universe already, it's already known. So even though this is #1 in this series, I don't think it really is. I think it's more like, you know, something where you need to have read all of those previous things and understand all that background in order to make sense of it. So I didn't really get into this, and I couldn't really enjoy it. I thought the art was fine, but it didn't really stand out to me. So overall, it was not my cup of tea, but if you're somebody who's in the Marvel Universe, it might work for you. And lastly, I finished an illustrated work called The Electric State by Simon Stalenhag. This is a really curious book. I don't think I've seen anything else done quite like it before. It is basically a dystopian short story that has full-page painting illustrations to go along with the story as you read through it. Definitely not a kid's book though. This is very much for adults. It tells the story of a young girl, sort of a young teenage girl, who is on a road trip going west in a kind of alternate history United States in the 90s, where humanity has kind of collapsed due to some technological issues, technological advancements that went wrong. And she has to navigate some very scary surroundings in order to try to find a better place. And this book was just really fascinating. The artwork was absolutely spectacular. I thought it was so beautiful and haunting, and the story was really creepy. I was just, you know, there was so much mystery, so much dread, so much kind of very subtle horror in this story that it was really, really gripping. And it explored a lot of interesting themes, just especially related to issues of depression and neglect and addiction, and it was just fascinating. I really enjoyed this, and this was the only book that isn't actually a finalist for the Hugos this year. I think it was one of those things that was nominated but didn't make it to the short list, which makes me really sad because I enjoyed this thoroughly, and I think that more people should read it. So now that I've talked about the books that I read for July, I want to talk about some of the themes that I noticed while I was reading. Unlike some other months, I want to expand this topic a little bit broader. I have read a lot of things for the Hugos this year because I voted in a lot of different categories, and that means that I don't want to restrict what I'm talking about to just July. I'd like to talk about all of the books that I read that were part of July or part of the Hugos in general, and that's a lot of books. So if you haven't seen, I do have a couple of playlists, which I will link below. I've got the playlist for my monthly priorities and, you know, the TBR for July, but I also have a playlist for the Hugos for this year. And in that, I've got a bunch of discussion videos with my husband Sush, where we talk about the short story, novelette, novella, and novel finalists for the Hugos. So everything that I'm going to talk about in these discussions of themes that I saw in the books is going to include all of those as well. So that's a lot of things. I also have not been reading previously for the Hugos. I've never read for the Hugos before, or really any other literary award. So I have not been reading critically or even just reflectively for very long. So really this year is the first time that I've actually been kind of like thinking through and reflecting on what I've read. So I'm going to talk about the themes that I noticed, what a lot of these books that are nominated for Hugos have been talking about, but these themes very well are probably something that were, present in previous years as well. I just didn't read for them, didn't notice. So I'm not trying to say these are unique for this year. It's just what I noticed when I was reading this year. So the first theme that popped out to me was that there were a lot of books discussing ecological disasters, discussing things where basically the earth has become uninhabitable. That's definitely a really big theme. It kind of ranges from how severe it is. In The Black God's Drums by P. Djèlí Clark, it's not that the earth isn't inhabitable, but there is a big focus on hurricanes and their destructive nature and their severity. So that kind of reminds me of a lot of the global warming stuff that is happening, especially in the Gulf. And there it is a big plot point that the hurricane is coming and that's going to strongly affect things and possibly kill people. Then a lot of the other more sci-fi type stories really focus on kind of the earth going very badly because of ecological disasters. Some of them not humans' faults. So in The Calculating Stars by Mary Robinette Kowal, there's a big asteroid, meteor, one of those things, big rock that comes and hits the earth, and it's so big and it hits the ocean that it causes, big changes in weather patterns. And that means that the earth is going to become much too hot for humanity to live on, and so they have to accelerate the space program so that they can get off the earth. Similarly, in 9 Last Days on Planet Earth by Daryl Gregory, there are these seeds that come down to Earth, tons and tons and tons of these seeds, and they are alien plant life forms, and they end up kind of taking over the Earth and really displacing humanity because these seeds are taking up, these plants are taking up all of the resources. In some more, it's actually humanity's fault, there is Record of a Spaceborn Few, which has the fleet of humanity leaving the Earth because it's no longer inhabitable. There's also Trail of Lightning by Rebecca Roanhorse, which is a post-apocalyptic kind of dystopian novel where the Navajo Nation has created walls around them that protected them, but the rest of the US has become kind of uninhabitable or very negatively impacted because of big shifts in the ecology, big shifts in the weather patterns, and kind of made things not good. So ecological disasters is a theme in so many of these stories that really stood out to me. Another theme that I noticed was the focus on AI and sort of on the choices that AI makes, as well as on its personhood, whether or not we could consider AI to be, anything like a human, something that has rights. So on kind of the more just choices side, the short story Stet by Sarah Gailey looks at automated cars and the decisions that they make when driving, especially with relation to, kind of if you have to hit something, what do you hit? So those kind of choices that the algorithm makes. Looking more at the personhood questions, there is When We Were Starless by Simone Heller, and in that story, the main character comes across an old, almost defunct AI system and kind of befriends it. So there's this question of friendship. There's also questions of, whether or not that AI has rights to stay alive, those sorts of things. In Artificial Condition by Martha Wells, the main character, Murderbot, is sort of this mixture of robot and organic parts, and it goes kind of rogue, takes control of itself, and there's big questions of, Is it able to be in charge of itself? Is it able to make its own decisions, to be a person? And does it have any sort of legal rights? In the Wayfarer series by Becky Chambers, the second book, A Closed and Common Orbit, focuses on an AI that gets a body kit. It gets a sort of like a human looking kit, and it pretends to be human, even though this is like illegal in that world. And it goes through a lot of issues of adapting. So it is an AI who is used to having so many different cameras and purpose and all sorts of things, and it's stuck in this human body. And it's not just a question of whether or not it has rights, but it's also questions of if this is even a good thing for it to be stuck in a human body, and how it adapts to that, and how it relates to other people, and just kind of what issues that causes when you're not actually human, but you're stuck in a human body. So lots of interesting questions revolving around AI. The other big theme that I saw in so many different books was a focus on diversity in speculative fiction. And within this, there are many sort of sub-themes. So one of the sub-themes is kind of a focus on an integration of science fiction and fantasy with non-Western mythologies and cultures. So for example, the Tea Master and the Detective by Aliette de Bodard imagines this future sci-fi world which is based heavily on Vietnamese culture and mythology. There is Trail of Lightning by Rebecca Roanhorse, which is a post-apocalyptic dystopian urban fantasy that focuses on Navajo mythology and culture. There is The Black God's Drums by P. Djèlí Clark, which is a alternate history steampunk novella that focuses on, I think, a lot of Haitian gods, as well as sort of New Orleans culture, that mixture of French and Caribbean and Spanish and American. There is If at First You Don't Succeed, Try Again by Zen Cho, where the main character is an Imugi, which is a Korean almost dragon. There's also Binti, the Night Masquerade by Nnedi Okorafor, which focuses on sci-fi, focusing on Nigerian characters who go to space. And so there's this integration of this universal galactic type of culture of many different beings with also Nigerian culture. So there's all of these stories that focus on different mythologies, different cultures, and how that can kind of create a different version of sci-fi and fantasy. Another common sub-theme was race and ethnicity. You could see this in the short story The Secret Lives of the Nine Negro Teeth of George Washington by Venderson Djèlí Clark, where in this Clark examines the sources of teeth that George Washington had in sort of like his dentures, and each of them coming from a different like slave, and exploring those people's histories and mixing it with a lot of kind of a social justice theme, as well as tons of magic and supernatural actions. So that was a really interesting reimagining. There is also Beneath the Sugar Sky by Seanan McGuire. This has a lot of different characters who have different backgrounds, but one of them is kind of like a Mexican type of background, and he has gone to a portal world that is very Dia de los Muertos, and so there's lots of explorations of sort of how he feels and if he feels like he fits in with the other kids, and kind of how that cultural difference affected him. Then there's also Abbott by Saladin Ahmed, and that clearly is really focused on race and social justice issues, because it is all about kind of the police and their treatment of the Black community in Detroit in the 1970s. Another sub-theme is gender and sexuality. You see this in Beneath the Sugar Sky by Seanan McGuire, where one of the characters is asexual, another of the characters is trans. They just have a lot of interesting explorations of different expressions of gender and sexuality in this entire series, really, by Seanan McGuire. So I liked that. There's also Revenant Gun and really the whole Machineries of Empire series by Yoon Ha Lee. There are so many explorations of people being in bodies that are different from who they feel they are, of people having expressions of their gender in different ways. There are men who have like very feminine things. There are women who have very masculine things. There are also just people who express a different gender than they were born with, and that's very much a part of the story, as well as people inhabiting a body that is not their own, but is a different gender. There's also just very clearly all sorts of sexual things going on. There's really tons of same-sex type of relationships, but also really commonly polyamorous relationships. Many of the families discussed in this series have multiple, mothers and fathers. It goes a little far for me in the sexuality, in that there's also a lot of exploration of incest, as well as of kind of sexual abuse. So there's a lot of sexuality explored in this series. And the last sub-themes that I noticed were feminism, as well as kind of religious intolerance, which were both of these were explored in The Calculating Stars by Mary Robinette Kowal, where the main character Alma is Jewish and she is a scientist, and she experiences a lot of bias and prejudice directed against her for both of these reasons. Similarly, Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik, very feminist, and also focuses on a Jewish main character who is super strong and faces a lot of backlash directed towards her because of her religion. So both of these books covered both of these themes pretty well, I thought. There's just a real focus on being strong and kind of respecting women and their ability to make their own decisions, as well as how to deal with religious intolerance. Okay, now that I've talked about all of these different themes that I've noticed in the Hugo nominations for this year, I wanted to give you guys just a couple of recommendations, if you don't have time to read all of these books, of the things that I would recommend that you read. I'm gonna limit myself to just recommendations of 3 books that I read in July, but if you want to check out those discussion videos that my husband Sush and I did rank the books that I read. So you just pick the top book, which is the last thing that we discussed in each of those, and that's the book that I have as a favorite for that category. Sometimes there's more than one favorite. There's a lot of really good books this year. But for July, if you only had time to read 3 of these books, I think the books that I would recommend are Revenant Gun by Yoon Ha Lee, which is the 3rd book in the Machineries of Empire series, just because I really thought that this series did such a good job of making military science fiction also focus on a lot of important issues relating to community and belonging, and relating to also gender and sexuality. And I thought that made such a layered book that really offered so much more than just military sci-fi, and made that a cool thing for anybody who's not into that to try getting into. Another book that makes this list of top 3 is The Tea Master and the Detective by Aliette Bodard. I thought that this was such a joy to read. It was really fascinating. I loved the mystery, and I think also for anybody who's not familiar with sort of Vietnamese culture, who's not familiar with science fiction, this gives you a nice intro into it, while also pulling in a lot of things that maybe you already know about, this sort of Sherlock Holmes retelling. So lots of people have seen Sherlock Holmes TV shows or movies, or have read the original books. And so this could be another way to try out some science fiction if that's not so much your thing. And lastly, I think I would recommend The Electric State by Simon Stalenhag. This is just such a cool book. I really think that this fascinates me with its unique approach. I guess an illustrated book isn't maybe so unique, but I really feel like that's a unique thing directed at adults, with paintings that are not just illustrations, but I mean really truly gorgeous artwork, you know, beautiful oil paintings, and a very adult style of dystopian future, really looking at how humanity can, you know, let itself become something that falls apart through its issues with addiction and kind of mistakes made with technology. So it's kind of a dark book, but I thought it was really fascinating and really well done. Okay, so that wraps up the Hugo reading that I did for July. If you made it to the end of this video, especially if you have watched any of the Hugo discussion videos or the weekly wrap-ups that I have done before, gold star for you. That was a lot of perseverance, especially given that much of this is a repetition of some of the things I've already talked about, but hopefully doing this sort of comprehensive review at the end added something. I don't know. I semi-considered not doing this video because I'd done so many discussions already, but then the completionist in me decided that I wanted to do it. So in any case, if you have read any of the books that I've talked about, if you have any thoughts, if you noticed any other themes to do with some of the books that came out in 2018 for speculative fiction, I'd love to hear it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So please leave comments down below. And again, gold star for getting through this.